Hello, and welcome back for Chapter 9 of Bound for Oregon. So, in Chapter 8, we got to hear that a couple of the other parties in their wagon train have decided to move at a faster pace, even though Mary Ellen's father does not agree with them. So, the two wagons go ahead and leave without them. We also saw a little disagreement with how people should be treated based on the color of their skin. And the one thing Mary Ellen and her father really strongly believe in is that everybody deserves to be treated fairly and freely. So here in Chapter 9, we know that Mary Ellen's family and one other family are traveling together in their pursuit to get to Oregon. So Chapter 9. It was mid-June now, the month of roses. I looked for wild rose bushes as I walked behind the wagon on the heavy, hot sand road that wound next to the Platte River. And finally one day I found one. Its tight, pale pink buds almost ready to burst into bloom. As we made our way up the river, we passed by Fort Kearney, a small military post with buildings made of sun-dried bricks. These were the first man-made structures we had seen in over 200 miles. We were hoping to reach the next fort, Fort Laramie in Wyoming. By the 4th of July, that would be close to 700 miles we had traveled since leaving Independence. But even then, Father said, we still would not be halfway to Oregon. With all of his care, some of the oxen were still limping, and Rover kept on lagging far behind the wagon. "Here, Rover," called John one day, flashing his quick grin. "I'll give you a lift." Leaning over, he scooped up Rover and placed him in front of his horse. "Ride, horsey!" Cynthia laughed, clapping her pudgy hands. But Rover wasn't happy with the idea, and neither was Polly. She kicked, and Rover struggled so desperately that finally John had to put him down. "All right, have it your way," he said. The next day he tried again, and after a few days both dog and horse became resigned to it. It was a comical sight to see Rover sitting up straight in the saddle in front of John, barking at rabbits and prairie dogs as he rode along. We continued to meet many other wagon trains. One, which I especially noticed, had the words "Sure" and "Swift" painted on its wagon covers. The wagons on this train were pulled by fast mules instead of oxen, and its people dressed in style. They seemed to be looking down their noses at us as they sailed past our slow-moving wagons. Mrs. Grant said she had heard that they had music in their camp every night, and used silverware and real white linens for dinner. After this train passed us, they would camp for several days, so we would catch up with them. But then a day or two their mules would go breezing by us again. I couldn't help feeling a little twinge of envy at how easy their journey seemed to be. The road we traveled on now had been beaten down by thousands of hooves. On dry days, billows of dust rose beneath our wheels, and when it rained, tiny streams turned into bogs, and mosquitoes swarmed, making a small cloud around each of the oxen's heads. David Grant called them galley nippers. We snapped and scratched. Poor Cynthia's face was covered with huge red welts. Some nights we could hardly sleep because of all the galley nippers buzzing in our ears. We were also having trouble with drinking water. The water in the Platte was so warm and muddy, it was barely fit to drink. We had to let it settle before using it. One time John measured the water in his tin cup and found that the bottom fourth was all mud. Since we had crossed the Platte, wood for the fires had been scarcer and scarcer. One evening there was none to be found anywhere. "We can't cook without fires," said Mrs. Grant in dismay. "How can we have fires without wood?" Mr. Grant looked at her, a hint of a Haldane grin showing his eyes. "I'll show you," he offered. In just a few minutes he had picked up an armful of buffalo chips, the dried old droppings from passing buffalo that littered the grass around us. Setting a match to them, he soon had a good hot fire. But both Mrs. Grant and Mother turned away, covering their noses at the smell. "I can't cook our food over a fire like that," Mother complained to Father. Her face was pale, as if she might actually be sick. "It is hard, Angelina, I know," he replied gently, "but we have no choice. If there is nothing to cook with except buffalo chips, we must use them and be grateful for them." Mother still did not like it. However, buffalo chips were the only fuel available. At first she handled them gingerly, wearing gloves and holding them out at arm's length with a look of great distaste. But within a few days, she and Lavinia had me helping her, piling them into our aprons with hardly a thought. As we moved along, we began to see more and more signs of distress ahead. Sometimes it was worn-out oxen abandoned to the wolves. Sometimes it was broken down wagons with tires off and wheel spokes snapped. In some cases, Father told us what was left had been converted into a two-wheeled cart so the travelers could go on. Another time we came upon the remains of an ox that looked just like Star, one of Mr. Tedros's oxen. I thought of Sarah Jane and wondered how she was making out. And quite frequently now, we would see a freshly dug grave where some poor traveler had been buried. One afternoon, as I was walking along, keeping an eye out for more roses, I saw a wagon moving toward us at an unusual fast pace. As it came closer, I could make out the bearded man with the wild-looking eyes, beating his oxen with a whip to make them go faster. His wife and about 6 fair-haired, freckled-faced children peered out at us from inside the wagon, their faces full of fear. "It is the cholera," the man called out to us without stopping his wagon. "It is terrible upriver. Whole families are being wiped out, so we're just going back home." And snapping his whip again, he moved hastily on his way. Mother's mouth tightened at this news, and I thought I could see new lines of worry creasing Father's forehead. We had already heard rumors of an epidemic of this dreaded disease raging along the river. It struck suddenly with severe vomiting, diarrhea, and high fever. Its victims would lapse into unconsciousness and often be dead within hours. That night, Father and Mother and the Grants talked for a long time in low, concerned voices. But there was nothing to do. They decided but to go on, taking as many precautions as possible. We planned to keep moving as fast as we could. And Mother told Lavinia and Cynthia and me we were to stay close to the wagon at all times. Soon we began passing other wagons that had been forced to halt because of illness. Mother and Father tried to help some of these families by offering our medicines and the small supply of milk that Blackie still gave. Father also gave advice on caring for the sick. Others, in their frantic haste to escape the place of infection, kept on traveling as fast as they could, their sick ones jouncing and jolting inside the wagons, and every day we passed, more fresh graves. One day, just after we had stopped for nooning, Lavinia came to Mother, her usual pink cheeks suddenly pale beneath her sunbonnet. "I don't feel well," she complained in a small voice. In a few minutes, she was violently sick. "We will have to make camp right here," Father decided quickly. He and John set up a tent some distance from the wagon and made a bed inside and carried Lavinia to it. Now everyone must stay far away, he warned. Only an hour later, Cynthia also turned pale and began to whimper and hold to her stomach. Soon she was just as sick as Lavinia. Father laid her down next to Lavinia inside the tent. For the remainder of the day, he took charge of caring for them. The rest of us hurried about, trying to help. John and I had to look after the animals, keep a fire continuously burning, fetch water and keep it warm, and Lavinia and Cynthia were suffering from terrible cramps and chills, and they were constantly in need of something. As I went from one chore to another, all I could think about was that the thing we had dreaded most had happened. My 2 little sisters had cholera. The Grants made camp a considerable distance away to keep clear of the infection, but they promised to wait for us, offering to do anything they could to help. There was not much to be done without a doctor or other medical help nearby. That night, Father slept just outside the door of the tent. John was underneath the wagon, and Mother and I were alone inside it. It was close to midnight when she came to bed. I couldn't sleep and was trying to read by the light of our little oil lamp hung on the ridgepole, but I couldn't seem to read either. Mother's face looked different than I had ever seen it. As she slowly removed the combs from her hair, it tumbled down over her shoulders, soft and shining, as yellow almost as Cynthia's in the lamplight. The light illuminated the planes of her cheekbones and the curves of her neck. She seemed beautiful to me in that moment, but then I saw her eyes. In them was a strange, awful blankness, as if she had been stunned by a blow she had not seen coming. The dim light made it hard to be sure, but I thought I saw tears. "Have you said your prayers, Mary Ellen?" she asked, in a voice that was barely a whisper. And without waiting for me to reply, she knelt down. Quietly there in the shadow dark, I joined her, and side by side, we offered our prayers for our sister. "Bless them and keep them, O Lord," Mother finished, her voice breaking a little just at the end. "Amen." I felt tears beginning to burn in my eyes. "Amen," I echoed. Outside, the night seemed suddenly hushed. Maybe I thought hopefully they were sleeping. In the darkness, I felt Mother's finger reach out and touch mine. Cool and firm, they squeezed once and were gone, but their touch lingered like a prayer. "Try to sleep," she said softly, and a minute later, blowing out the lamp. And surprisingly, I did. When I awoke the next morning, I was puzzled for a moment to find myself alone in the wagon. Then with a pang, I remembered Lavinia and Cynthia. "How are they?" I asked anxiously, poking my head outside. In the daylight, her hair tucked back tightly, wearing her apron, Mother looked herself again, piling coals on top of the Dutch oven to cook the biscuits. Only her eyes were grave. "Your father says that Cynthia is not nearly as bad as Lavinia, but Lavinia is very sick. I felt as if I ought to whisper as I moved about the morning doing my chores. On my way down to the river for water, I passed by the tent. Through the opening, I caught a glimpse of Lavinia's face. It was so white and still. I hardly recognized it as my sister. Feeling a sharp pitch of fear way down in my insides, I hurried past. The other wagons were stopped near us. The cholera epidemic had been growing worse by the day, and nearly every evening we heard about new illness or death. Sometimes it was father or mother or an elderly relative, but most often it seemed to be the children. One night, 17 new graves were dug near the river. While we were suffering with our fear and anxiety, the animals made the most of their unexpected rest. Rover lay sleeping in the sun for hours. Horses rolled around in the grass, then fed to their heart's content. The cattle would graze until they had their fill, lie down, and chew their cud, then lazily get to their feet and start grazing once more. Meanwhile, father kept his lonely vigil beside Lavinia and Cynthia. Hour after hour, day after day, he would not allow the rest of us anywhere near them, for fear of our catching the infection. And every little while, mother would take food to him and ask quietly, "How's Lavinia?" The father shook his head. In a few days, Cynthia was well enough to be taken out of the tent. Before she could be allowed near us, though, she had to be bathed and all of her clothing and bedding disinfected. Father piled it all in the washtub and poured boiling water over it, then hung everything out in the sun to dry. We made up a comfortable bed for her on the spring seat, and father carried her to it. I was so happy to see her again, but she was weak and fretful and needed constant care. John and I tried for 3 days before we could make her smile. One morning, I heard father asking mother for our small looking glass. He took it into the tent, and a few minutes later he handed it back to her. "What's the matter?" she asked. Mother's breath seemed to catch. He couldn't tell if Lavinia was breathing or not. So he held the looking glass over her mouth to see if any moisture collected. I felt something squeeze in my stomach. "And did it?" I forced myself to whisper. "He thinks so, but we cannot yet know how it will turn out. We can only wait and pray." For 2 days, Lavinia hovered between life and death. Father looked so exhausted that mother begged him to rest, but he rarely did. At times he was sure she was dead. She lay so very still. And once I heard him repeating the 23rd Psalm. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." His voice cracked, and he could not go on. So I assure him, "I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." Sometimes I wondered if it could be my fault that this had happened to my sister. Hadn't I often been jealous of her happy disposition, the way mother smiled at her and frowned at me? And hadn't I felt angry that she had taken so easily to this new mother and had no thoughts of another? With shame, I remembered all the times I had spoken impatiently to her and refused to play games. One afternoon, with my chore finished and Cynthia napping, I wandered aimlessly around, unable to think of anything to do. "Why don't you get your reticule and work on your quilt blocks?" Mother suggested. I went to the trunk to find it, but when I saw Lavinia's, tears welled up in my eyes and I couldn't touch it. Instead, I walked down to the river, close to the water. I discovered a large bush with a few wild roses just beginning to bloom. They were so fresh and pink and sweet-smelling that I had to pick some. Carrying them back to the camp, I put them in a pickle jar and set it down inside the tent. As I was about to walk away, Father came to the opening. "I think your sister may be breathing a little better," he said. "Would you heat up some milk and put it in a pinch of soda and bring it here?" My feet practically flew out over the ground as I ran to do what he asked. Crouched outside the tent door, I watched as Father lifted her head and tried to coax her to take some milk. "I think she swallowed a drop or two," he told me. The next morning, Lavinia opened her eyes and seemed to know where she was. Though she still could not speak, hope began to spring up in all of us. We gathered outside the tent. I was singing softly to Cynthia, and from inside, we could hear Father humming a line from his favorite hymns. "Earth has no sorrow that heaven cannot heal." A minute later, he stepped outside and smiled. "Lavinia seems to be enjoying your roses," he said. My heart leaped with joy and thankfulness as I hurried back to the wagon to help Mother prepare food for her. What did I care if I burned my fingers trying to make the toast? Surely now Lavinia was going to get well. 2 days later, Father bathed her, dressed her in clean, fresh clothes, and carried her to the improvised bed we made for her on the 2 splint-bottomed chairs. Then he set to work, disinfecting the tent and scrubbing her clothes and his own. As I walked back and forth from the river, carrying brimming pails of water for the washtubs, I discovered more and more rose bushes. All of them were bursting with blooms, and each one seemed prettier to me than the last. I set down my pail, picking as many roses as I could carry. I brought them back to Lavinia. She was sitting in the shade of the wagon, propped up with pillows, her doll tucked into her bed beside her. Her cheeks, I noticed, had a little hint of color. See what I found? Holding out an armload of flowers. Smiling weakly, Lavinia reached out and buried her face in them. Oh, sister, she said, aren't they pretty roses? So we hear a very sad tale today with the story of this family. They were very lucky that both the girls did survive their little battle with cholera, but they will be very weak for the rest of this trip. So hopefully we'll find out through the rest of the next couple chapters that things continue to improve for them.